He flew home rich enough to buy the hospital, the street, and every building around it. But the man waiting for him was not in the family house. His father sat alone in a nursing home hallway, wearing donated slippers and holding a folded photo of a son he had been told would never come back. The staff thought he was just another forgotten old man. But when Julian Reed saw the discharge papers, the forged signature, and the woman standing beside his father like she already knew the family's secrets, he realized this was not neglect. It was a plan, and someone had buried the truth before he ever landed. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. 6 months earlier, Julian still believed money had kept his father safe. At 44, Julian Reed had everything most people spent a lifetime chasing. He had just sold his cybersecurity company in London for more money than he ever imagined earning. Financial magazines called him brilliant, investors called him visionary, reporters wanted interviews. But none of that mattered during the 8-hour flight to Cleveland. For the first time in years, he was going home. Walter Reed was 76 now, stubborn, independent, and proud. Julian smiled as he thought about him. 5 years earlier, he had paid to renovate his father's house from top to bottom. New roof, new kitchen, better heating, accessibility upgrades for the future. Whenever he offered more help, Walter always laughed. "I'm old, not helpless," that was Walter. The calls had become less frequent over the years, but they never stopped. Sometimes they lasted 20 minutes, sometimes only 3. Still, Julian never worried. His sister Monica lived nearby. She handled things, at least that was what everyone said. When his driver left him in front of the old neighborhood that afternoon, everything looked familiar. The same maple trees, the same quiet sidewalks, the same brick homes. For a moment he felt like no time had passed at all. Then he reached Walter's house and stopped. The front porch furniture was gone. The flower beds were dead. A lockbox hung from the front door. Julian frowned. Maybe his father had hired contractors. Maybe there was some repair work underway. He walked up the driveway and tried his key. It didn't fit. That was the first moment something felt wrong. The second came when he looked through the front window. The house was nearly empty, not abandoned, not destroyed, just stripped. A few pieces of furniture remained, everything else was gone. His stomach tightened. A voice called from across the street, "Julian?" He turned. An elderly neighbor he vaguely remembered was standing beside her mailbox. Her expression immediately worried him. "Mrs. Lawson?" She nodded. "Oh my goodness, nobody told you?" The words landed heavily. "Told me what?" The woman hesitated. For several seconds she seemed unsure whether she should speak. Then she sighed. "I thought you'd come months ago." Julian felt the air leave his lungs. "Come for what?" Mrs. Lawson glanced toward the house, then back at him. "Your father hasn't lived here for a long time." The silence that followed felt enormous. "What do you mean?" He was moved. Moved where? Maple Grove Nursing Center? Julian stared at her. A nursing home. The words made no sense. Walter hated the idea of nursing homes. He had said it countless times. If he ever needed help, he wanted to stay in his own house. Everyone in the family knew that. "There has to be some mistake," Julian said. Mrs. Lawson's eyes softened. "I wish there was." 25 minutes later, he pulled into the parking lot of Maple Grove Nursing Center. The building was clean enough. Nothing terrible, nothing dramatic. That somehow made it worse. Places like this hid loneliness behind fresh paint and polite smiles. Inside, a receptionist looked up. "Can I help you?" "I'm here for Walter Reed." Something flickered across her face. Recognition, pity, the kind of expression people wore when they already knew part of a story you hadn't heard yet. She pointed down a hallway, room 1112. "But he's usually sitting near the east corridor." Julian followed the signs. His footsteps echoed softly. Wheelchairs rolled past. Televisions murmured behind half-open doors. Then he saw him. Walter sat alone beside a window, not reading, not sleeping, just sitting. The man looked smaller. His clothes were worn. His slippers clearly did not belong to him originally. In one hand he held a folded photograph. For a second Julian couldn't move. This wasn't the father he remembered. This was a man who looked like he'd spent months waiting for someone who never arrived. "Dad?" Walter slowly looked up. His eyes widened. The photograph slipped from his hand. Neither spoke. The shock was too large for words. Then Walter stood as much as his body allowed and whispered one sentence. "You finally came." Julian crossed the room immediately. "Dad, what happened?" Walter's expression changed. Not relief, not happiness, something closer to hurt. "You approved it." Julian froze. "Approved what? This place?" Walter gestured around the corridor. "The paperwork. The transfer. The calls that stopped coming." Julian stared at him. "I never approved anything." Walter looked away. For a moment he seemed exhausted, like a man who had repeated the same disappointment too many times. A quiet voice interrupted them. "Mr. Reed." Julian turned. A woman in navy scrubs stood nearby, dark hair, tired eyes, a badge identifying her as Elena Torres. She looked around carefully before speaking, then she lowered her voice. "If I were you," she said, "I wouldn't trust every document in his file." Julian felt something cold move through his chest. "What does that mean?" Elena hesitated, like someone standing at the edge of a decision, then she handed him a folder. "Start here." Julian opened it. The admission paperwork sat on top. He scanned the pages, then his eyes stopped. There it was, his name, his authorization, his digital signature, a signature he had never given. His pulse began to race. He turned the page and saw the listed emergency contacts. The first was supposed to be him. Second made his blood run cold. Monica Reed. Monica Reed. Julian stared at the name for several seconds. The hallway around him seemed to fade. The televisions, the wheelchairs, the distant conversations, everything became background noise. His sister's name sat there in black ink. Primary emergency contact. Authorized representative, healthcare liaison. He slowly turned another page, then another. Everywhere he looked, Monica appeared. Not him, not Walter. "Monica, what is this?" he asked quietly. Walter looked down at the folder and rubbed a hand across his face. "She said you were busy." Julian swallowed. "Dad, at first I believed her." The words carried no anger. Somehow that made them hurt more. Walter stared through the nearby window. "She said you were traveling constantly. She said you didn't answer. She said your company was having problems." Julian felt something tighten in his chest. His company had not been having problems. He had sold it for hundreds of millions of dollars. And even before that, he had answered every message he received from his father, or at least he thought he had. "I never stopped answering your calls." Walter looked at him. For the first time since Julian arrived, there was something fragile in his eyes. "Then why did you disappear?" Julian had no answer, because suddenly he wasn't sure what had happened. Elena shifted her weight nearby. She clearly wanted to leave them alone, but she also looked like someone carrying information she wasn't sure she should share. Julian noticed. "Miss Torres." She glanced up. "Yes, you told me not to trust the paperwork." The hesitation on her face was immediate. Staff members learned quickly where the boundaries were, crossed them, and jobs disappeared, especially in places like this. Walter surprised them both. "Tell him." Elena looked at the older man. "Walter, tell him." The firmness in his voice remained intact despite everything else that had been taken from him. Elena exhaled slowly. Then she pulled up a chair. "I can't prove anything," she said carefully. "But some things never felt right." Julian sat down. For the next several minutes he listened. The story was not dramatic. That was what made it disturbing. Walter had arrived 8 months earlier. According to the official records, he had experienced increasing confusion and difficulty living independently. Monica had presented documentation supporting placement. Everything appeared legitimate, at least on paper. But Elena had worked with older adults for nearly 15 years. She knew confusion. She knew cognitive decline. She knew when someone was forgetting reality. Walter had never looked like that patient. "He remembers conversations from months ago," she said. "He reads newspapers every day. He corrects people when they get facts wrong." Walter gave some small snort. Elena ignored him. "There are good days and bad days for everyone. But what was written in some of those assessments didn't match the man sitting in front of me." Julian felt his pulse quicken. "Did anyone challenge it?" "Not officially. Why not?" Elena gave him a look. "Because everyone knew the answer. Families usually won. Residents rarely did. Money, authority, signatures, legal documents. Those things carried weight. An elderly person's objections often didn't." Walter suddenly laughed. The sound was bitter. Old people become invisible. Nobody disagreed. For several moments, silence settled over the three of them. Then Julian made a decision. He pulled out his phone. Monica answered on the third ring. "Julian?" Her voice sounded surprised, maybe genuinely surprised, maybe not. I'm in Cleveland. A pause, then another. Oh, not excitement. Not relief, just one word. I'm at Maple Grove. This time the silence lasted longer. Finally she spoke. You found Dad. Julian stood and moved farther down the hallway, away from Walter, away from Elena. Why is he here? Her response came immediately. Because he needed care. He needed a nursing home. He wasn't safe alone. Julian looked through the window at his father. Walter was sitting exactly where he had been, watching, waiting. A man who looked forgotten. He doesn't seem confused. Monica's tone hardened slightly. You've been here 20 minutes. What happened to his house? Another pause. That's complicated. No, it isn't. Julian, what happened? He heard Monica exhale. The sound of someone preparing a familiar speech. The house became impossible to manage. There were maintenance issues, medical costs, property taxes. I paid for everything. You paid for some things. The correction landed sharply. Julian frowned. Something about the conversation felt rehearsed. Like Monica had expected questions and already prepared answers. We should talk in person, she said. When? Tonight. Where? My house. Julian agreed, then ended the call. When he returned, Walter was staring at the floor. The photograph still rested in his hand. Julian finally looked at it. The picture was old, not ancient, just worn. It showed the two of them standing outside Walter's renovated house, one arm around each other's shoulders, both smiling. Julian felt a wave of guilt he hadn't expected, because he suddenly realized something painful. He had measured love through transactions, house repairs, money transfers, monthly support, insurance coverage, the practical things, useful things. But Walter had not needed money most of the time. He had needed his son, and those weren't the same thing. Dad? Walter looked up. I'm going to figure this out. The older man studied him, long enough to decide whether he believed him. Finally he nodded. I know. Those two words nearly broke Julian. Not because they offered comfort. Because they offered trust he wasn't sure he deserved. A few hours later, after speaking with the nursing home's administrator and requesting copies of every document they were willing to release, Julian walked toward the parking lot. The sun was beginning to set. The air felt colder. Elena was leaving too. She carried a worn canvas bag over one shoulder. Nothing expensive, nothing polished, just practical. She looked surprised when Julian called her name, Miss Torres. She stopped. You don't owe me anything, he said, but thank you. Elena looked away briefly, almost uncomfortable with gratitude. I didn't do much. You did more than everyone else. Something moved across her face, a sadness that seemed older than the moment. Sometimes that's not hard. Julian watched her walk toward an aging sedan parked near the edge of the lot. No luxury, no influence, no lawyers, no authority. Yet she had been the first person to tell him the truth. The contrast wasn't lost on him. He was halfway to his rental car when a nurse hurried out of the building. Mr. Reed, Julian turned. The nurse approached holding several loose papers. You asked for copies earlier, yes? We found one more file attached to his records. Julian accepted the folder. The nurse lowered her voice. It probably means nothing, but she didn't sound convinced. After she left, Julian opened the folder beside his car. Most of it contained routine paperwork, medication logs, assessment notes, transfer forms. Then he found a handwritten incident report, a brief note, only 3 lines, written 6 months earlier. Resident repeatedly requested contact with individual named Clara Torres. Request redirected to family representative. No further action required. Julian froze. Clara Torres, the same last name as Elena. Slowly, very slowly, he looked back toward the nursing home's entrance and saw Elena standing beneath the lights, watching him with an expression that suggested she already knew exactly what name he had just read. Elena stood beneath the nursing home's entrance light, her hand still resting on the strap of her canvas bag. She didn't walk away, neither did Julian. The evening air felt colder now. He held the incident report in one hand. Clara Torres. The name sat heavily in his mind. When he finally crossed the parking lot toward her, Elena looked almost resigned, as if she had known this moment would come eventually. You knew about this name? It wasn't a question. Elena nodded once. Yes. Julian stopped a few feet away. Who is Clara Torres? For a moment she looked toward the building behind them, toward Walter, then back at Julian. My mother, the answer came simply. No drama, no hesitation, and somehow that made it more powerful. Julian felt his pulse quicken. What connection does she have to my father? Elena laughed softly. Not because anything was funny, because she'd clearly asked herself that same question many times. That's the problem. She folded her arms. I don't know. The parking lot was nearly empty now. A maintenance worker smoked near a service entrance. A nurse climbed into her car and drove away. Life continued around them while something much larger quietly shifted beneath the surface. My mother died 3 years ago, Elena said. Before she passed, she left me a box. Julian listened carefully. A box, letters, documents, old photographs, things she'd kept for decades. Her eyes moved away briefly. There were a few references to a man named Walter. Julian felt something tighten inside him. What kind of references? Elena hesitated. Not enough to explain anything. Try me. She studied him, perhaps deciding whether he deserved honesty. Finally she spoke. My mother was private, extremely private. She smiled sadly. The kind of person who carried entire chapters of her life without sharing them. Julian understood that kind of silence. Families were full of it. There were letters she never mailed, Elena continued. A few photographs. Of Walter? No, that answer surprised him. There were references to Cleveland, references to someone she once loved. She shrugged. Nothing concrete. Then why did Walter ask for her? Elena looked genuinely frustrated. I wish I knew. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Julian asked the question that had been growing in his mind since he first saw the shared surname. Are you related to him? Elena's expression changed immediately. Not anger. Exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who had clearly asked herself the same thing. Do you know how many times I've gone through those records? Her voice remained calm. How many nights I've spent trying to understand who my mother was before I knew her. Julian stayed silent. There are gaps. She looked directly at him, large gaps. The words lingered between them. Then she reached into her bag. After a moment of searching, she pulled out a folded piece of paper. This is why I never told anyone. Julian accepted it. The document was old. A photocopy. Several sections had been blacked out, names removed, dates partially obscured. At the top sat a heading. Sealed adoption record. Julian looked up. Elena nodded. I got access to part of it after years of requests. His eyes returned to the page. Most of the information had been heavily restricted, but one fact stood out clearly. Adult adoptee, records incomplete, original parental information unavailable. Julian looked at her again. You were adopted, I found out when I was 21. The sentence carried decades of disappointment. No family revelation, no dramatic explanation. She laughed quietly. Just paperwork. The parking lot suddenly felt much smaller, much more complicated, because now the questions multiplying in Julian's mind no longer felt theoretical. They felt personal, dangerously personal. Does Walter know this? No, why not? Elena stared toward the nursing home. Because people like your family don't usually welcome surprises like me. The statement wasn't cruel, just honest. Julian couldn't argue. She continued. I work double shifts, I rent a room, I spend my days helping people whose own families rarely visit. Her eyes met his. Your world and mine don't overlap much. The truth of that landed harder than Julian expected. Because she wasn't wrong, he had built companies, traveled internationally, appeared on magazine covers. Meanwhile, Elena had been helping elderly strangers eat dinner and remember their medication schedules. Two completely different lives. Yet somehow they now stood at the center of the same mystery. A mystery neither of them understood. When Julian finally left, he didn't drive to Monica's house immediately. Instead, he stopped at a hotel near downtown Cleveland. He spread every document across a table. Admission records, medical assessments, financial paperwork, incident reports, everything. For 3 hours he examined every page, looking for patterns, looking for lies, looking for anything. Eventually he found one. A series of assessment reports completed over several months. Most were routine, but several stood out. Walter had been classified as increasingly confused, increasingly forgetful, increasingly dependent. Julian frowned. The dates bothered him. He compared them carefully. Then he noticed something else. Each assessment coincided with requests Walter had made. Phone privileges, legal consultations, requests to review personal records. The pattern wasn't proof. But it felt wrong, very wrong. His phone buzzed. Monica. He almost ignored it. Instead he answered. Where are you? She asked immediately. Her voice sounded controlled. Too controlled, working. It's almost 9. I know, we were supposed to talk. Julian leaned back in his chair. We will. Silence. Then Monica spoke more softly. You need to understand something. Julian waited. Dad wasn't himself. The sentence immediately irritated him. What does that mean? He became obsessed. With what? A pause, longer than necessary. Then she said it. A woman named Clara Torres. Julian sat up. Every nerve in his body seemed to sharpen. Monica continued. He talked about her constantly. When, before the nursing home, her voice carried just enough concern to sound believable. He wanted investigators, searches, records. Julian said nothing. He was chasing ghosts. The phrase landed heavily. Because Monica didn't know Julian had already spoken to Elena. She didn't know he'd seen the incident report. And she definitely didn't know he'd just learned Clara Torres was Elena's mother. What happened to the search? Julian asked. Monica hesitated. The hesitation was tiny, but it existed. I don't remember. A lie. Julian felt it immediately. The conversation ended shortly afterward. He sat in silence for several minutes. Then he made a decision. He called Walter. The nursing home transferred the call. His father's voice sounded tired, but alert. Dad? Julian. The relief in Walter's voice was impossible to miss. Julian closed his eyes briefly. Dad, I need to ask you something. Go ahead. Who was Clara Torres? The line went completely silent. Not for 1 second, not for 2. Long enough that Julian checked the phone screen. Finally Walter spoke. His voice sounded different now. Older somehow. Like a door opening into a room that had been locked for decades. Where did you hear that name? It doesn't matter. Another pause. Then Walter sighed. A deep, weary sigh. She was someone I loved. Julian sat perfectly still. When? A very long time ago. What happened? Walter laughed softly. The saddest sound Julian had heard all day. Life happened. The answer raised more questions than it solved. Dad, no. Walter interrupted gently. Not tonight. Julian rubbed his forehead. Why not? Because Walter said quietly. If Clara's name has resurfaced after all these years. He stopped. His breathing changed. Julian could hear it through the phone. Fear, hope, maybe both. Then Walter whispered something that made Julian's blood run cold. Because someone worked very hard to make sure I never found her. And before Julian could ask another question, Walter added one final sentence. The last person who promised to help me find Clara was Monica. The last person who promised to help me find Clara was Monica. Julian sat motionless after the call ended. The hotel room felt unnaturally quiet. Outside, Cleveland traffic moved through the night, headlights sliding across distant windows. But inside the room, there was only the growing weight of a realization he wasn't ready to accept. Monica had controlled nearly every part of Walter's life for years, his finances, his healthcare, his legal paperwork, and now, apparently, his search for Clara Torres. Julian looked again at the stack of records spread across the table. For the first time, he stopped viewing them as administrative documents. He started viewing them as evidence. The next morning, he skipped breakfast and drove straight to the office of an elder care attorney, recommended by a business contact. Her name was Rebecca Lang. She was in her early 50s, direct, practical, and clearly unimpressed by wealth, which Julian appreciated immediately. For nearly an hour, she reviewed the copies he had gathered. She said very little. Occasionally, she made notes. Occasionally, she highlighted sections. When she finally leaned back, her expression remained careful. What do you think? Julian asked. Rebecca folded her hands. I think several things concern me. Julian waited. Concern me how? The legal kind. That got his attention. She pointed to one document, the healthcare authority, then another, the placement authorization, then another, the financial management authorization. Julian noticed something. Each form carried slightly different dates, different witnesses, different notaries. Individually, none looked suspicious. Together, something felt off. Rebecca noticed his expression. You see it too. What? Timing. She slid several documents side by side. Julian stared. Walter's requests for legal review. Walter's requests for outside consultation. Walter's requests for phone access. Each appeared shortly before assessments describing him as confused or declining. The pattern emerged slowly, then all at once. A knot tightened in Julian's stomach. You're saying the decline may have been exaggerated. Rebecca chose her words carefully. I'm saying someone benefited from those assessments. The room fell silent. She continued. If your father was legally viewed as incapable, certain decisions become much easier. Julian already knew who had benefited: Monica, Philip, the people managing everything. But suspicion wasn't proof, not yet. Before leaving, Rebecca filed formal requests for Walter's complete records, medical records, care assessments, communication logs, everything. The process would take time, but time was no longer something Julian intended to waste. That afternoon he returned to Maple Grove. Walter was sitting in the common room near a window, the same chair, the same tired posture. But today something seemed different. He looked nervous, almost restless. "Dad?" Walter glanced around before lowering his voice. "I need to show you something." Julian sat down immediately. Walter reached into the pocket of his cardigan, carefully, slowly, like a man protecting something valuable. He removed several folded pages. The paper was worn from handling. Julian unfolded them, letters, or at least copies of letters. Some were incomplete, some had dates, others did not. Every one of them was addressed to Clara Torres. Julian looked up. "You wrote these?" Walter nodded. Over the last few years his voice sounded ashamed. Most of them were never sent. "Why not?" Walter stared out the window. "Because Monica said there was no point." The answer landed heavily. Julian continued reading. The letters weren't romantic. Not really. They were full of questions. Regret, memories, attempts to understand what had happened decades ago. One sentence stood out. "I still don't know why you disappeared." Julian reread it, then again, because suddenly something bothered him. Every version of the story he'd heard implied Clara left. Walter believed Clara left. Yet the letters suggested uncertainty. Not certainty. "What exactly happened between you and Clara?" Julian asked quietly. Walter closed his eyes briefly. "When your mother passed away, I hired someone to find Clara." Julian listened. "I thought enough time had passed." His voice weakened. "I thought maybe we could finally speak." "What happened?" "The investigator eventually found something." Walter swallowed. "Then Monica told me the trail ended." Julian felt his pulse increase. "And you believed her?" Walter laughed bitterly. "She's my daughter." The simplicity of the answer hurt, because it explained everything. Parents trusted their children, even when they shouldn't, especially when they shouldn't. Before Julian could respond, Elena appeared at the doorway. Something was wrong, he knew immediately. Her face had gone pale. "Mr. Reed." Julian stood. "What happened?" She looked toward Walter, then back at Julian. "Can I speak to you privately?" They stepped into a nearby hallway. Elena looked genuinely upset. "Administration called me into a meeting this morning." Julian frowned. "Why?" "They said there were concerns about professional boundaries." He immediately understood. Someone had complained, someone powerful, Monica. Elena didn't answer, she didn't need to. "They told me to limit interactions with your father." Julian felt anger flare. On what basis? No official basis. Her smile was tired. Just suggestions. The kind of suggestions employees understood very clearly. The kind that threatened jobs without saying so directly. Julian looked back toward the common room. Walter sat alone at the table, waiting, always waiting, for someone to decide what happened to him next. Something inside Julian hardened. No. Elena blinked. "What? No more." The words came out before he could soften them. "My father isn't a problem to be managed." For the first time, Elena looked surprised, not by his anger, by the fact that someone was finally using it on Walter's behalf. That evening, Julian stayed until visiting hours ended. Before leaving, he asked Walter one final question. "Dad, when was the last time you reviewed your estate documents?" Walter frowned. "A year ago, maybe." "You sure?" "I think so." The uncertainty bothered Julian. It bothered Walter too. "I requested changes." Julian looked up sharply. "What kind of changes?" Walter hesitated, then looked around. Even now, he seemed afraid someone might overhear. "There was someone I wanted included." Julian stared at him. "Included where?" "My will." The answer landed like a stone. Julian felt every piece of the puzzle shift slightly, not enough to reveal the picture, but enough to change its shape. "Who?" Walter looked toward the hallway where Elena had disappeared. The silence answered before the words did. When Walter finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Elena Torres." Julian stared at him. For several seconds neither moved. Then Walter added something even more disturbing. "I never finished the paperwork." That night, Julian returned to the hotel carrying more questions than answers. Near midnight, his phone rang. Rebecca Lang. He answered immediately. "What did you find?" The attorney sounded unusually serious. "We received part of the trust records." Julian sat upright, and silence. A long silence. Then Rebecca spoke. There was an amendment drafted 6 months ago. Julian felt his pulse accelerate. What amendment? It would have redirected a significant portion of Walter Reed's estate. To who? Rebecca took a breath, then read directly from the document. Beneficiary designation pending verification. Julian gripped the phone tighter. Verification of what? The attorney's voice dropped lower. Verification of the relationship between Walter Reed and Elena Torres, and for the first time, the possibility neither of them had dared say aloud stopped feeling impossible. The possibility neither of them had dared say aloud stopped feeling impossible. Julian sat awake for most of the night. The city lights outside his hotel window gradually faded into dawn, but sleep never came. Walter wanted Elena included in his estate, not out of charity, not out of gratitude, because he had believed there was some connection worth verifying. A connection Monica seemed determined to bury. By 7 o'clock, Julian was back in Rebecca Lang's office. She already had more documents waiting. Trust amendments, correspondence, legal filings. The deeper they looked, the stranger everything became. Rebecca placed a folder on the conference table. This never should have disappeared. Julian opened it. Inside sat a draft estate revision prepared nearly 7 months earlier. Walter's name was on it. The drafting attorney's name was on it. The document wasn't finalized, but its purpose was clear. Walter wanted part of his estate directed toward 2 things: a nursing scholarship fund and a beneficiary identified only as pending confirmation. Julian already knew who that person was. What happened to this? He asked. Rebecca's expression hardened. The attorney retired shortly afterward. Convenient. Julian kept reading. Several pages referenced a private investigation, the same investigation Monica had supposedly handled. The same investigation that had somehow led nowhere, except it clearly hadn't, because Walter had been preparing legal changes. People didn't rewrite wills over dead ends. They rewrote wills after finding something important, something real. That afternoon, Julian returned to Maple Grove. Elena was working near the east wing. She looked exhausted. The dark circles beneath her eyes seemed deeper than before. When she saw him approaching, she immediately knew something had happened. "What is it?" Julian handed her a copy of the trust amendment. She scanned the pages, then stopped. Her face lost color. No, the word barely escaped her lips. No, waited. Elena handed the papers back. "This is exactly why I wanted no part of this." Her voice was trembling now. Residents moved through the hallway around them. Nurses passed, life continued. But Elena looked trapped, like someone standing inside a nightmare she never asked to enter. "People are already talking." Julian frowned. "What people?" "Staff," she laughed bitterly. "They think I manipulated Walter." The accusation hit harder than Julian expected, because he immediately understood why. Poor caregiver, wealthy resident, potential inheritance. People always chose the easiest explanation, never the fairest one. "He trusts you," Julian said. "That's not a crime." Elena looked directly at him. "No." Then she lowered her voice. "But it can cost me my job." The honesty hurt, because she wasn't being dramatic, she was being realistic. One rumor could destroy everything she'd worked for. One accusation could become permanent. Julian suddenly saw the situation differently. For weeks he'd focused on Walter, on Monica, on the documents, but Elena had become collateral damage. A woman trying to do her job while wealthy strangers fought over secrets she didn't create. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. She looked surprised, then tired, then sad. "Don't apologize for something you didn't do." The problem was Julian wasn't entirely sure that was true. His family had created this mess. His family had dragged Elena into it, and somehow she was paying the price. Later that evening, Walter seemed stronger than usual. Not physically, emotionally, like he had finally reached a point where hiding things hurt more than revealing them. Julian found him sitting near the library alcove. A stack of old magazines rested beside his chair. He looked up as Julian approached. "You talked to Elena. It wasn't a question." Julian nodded. Walter sighed. "I was hoping she wouldn't get pulled into this." "Then why put her in the estate documents?" Walter stared at the floor. For a long moment he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice carried decades of regret. "Because by then I was almost certain." Julian sat down slowly. "Certain of what?" Walter rubbed his hands together. A nervous habit Julian hadn't seen since childhood. Except childhood was not something either of them wanted to revisit. Not now. "Clara and I planned a future once." His eyes remained fixed on the floor. We were serious. Julian listened quietly. We talked about marriage. The words sounded strange coming from Walter, not because they were unbelievable, because Julian had never imagined his father belonging to anyone before his mother. People rarely considered their parents as full human beings, only as parents, only as roles. Walter continued. Then everything fell apart. What happened? A faint smile crossed his face, a sad one. My family happened. Julian frowned. What does that mean? Walter laughed softly. The Reed family cared a lot about appearances. The statement explained more than Walter probably realized. Monica cared about appearances too, possibly more than anyone. We came from old money back then. Walter's voice grew distant. Not billionaire money, but enough. Julian stayed silent. Clara wasn't from that world. There it was, the divide, the invisible wall that separated people long before they ever met. Walter closed his eyes briefly. When she disappeared, I assumed she chose to leave. But you weren't sure, no. His answer came immediately. No, I wasn't. The certainty of that answer lingered. Because people who were abandoned usually knew it, Walter had spent decades wondering, which meant something had never made sense. Something had never fit, Dad. Walter looked up. What? Did Monica know about Clara before all this started? The older man became very still, too still, then he nodded. Years ago. Julian's pulse quickened. How many years? At least 10. The room seemed to narrow. 10 years. Monica knew. 10 years. And somehow Walter still ended up in a nursing home believing his son had abandoned him. 10 years, and Clara remained missing. The silence between them grew heavy. Finally Walter spoke again. There was something else. Julian looked up sharply. What? Walter hesitated. His jaw tightened. His eyes drifted toward the window. Whatever he was about to say clearly frightened him. Several years ago, an investigator contacted me. Julian immediately leaned forward. The investigator you hired? Walter nodded. He found something. Every nerve in Julian's body seemed to sharpen. What did he find? Walter swallowed. A relative. Julian's heartbeat accelerated. What kind of relative? The old man looked exhausted suddenly. Like revisiting this memory physically hurt. I don't know. What do you mean? He wouldn't tell me over the phone. Walter's voice cracked slightly. He said he needed to meet in person. Julian felt the room tighten around him. What happened? The answer came quietly. Too quietly. Monica took over the communication after that. Silence, then another silence. The kind that carried its own meaning. Walter never met the investigator, never saw the report, never heard the findings. Everything stopped with Monica. Julian sat there trying to absorb it. Then Walter added one final piece. A piece that changed everything again. The investigator sent something. What? A photograph. Julian stared. A photograph of who? Walter slowly reached into the pocket of his cardigan. His fingers trembled slightly. Not from age. From memory he pulled out a folded envelope, one he had hidden for years, one Monica apparently never found. Julian carefully opened it. Inside was a faded photograph. An adult woman standing beside Clara Torres. Nothing unusual at first glance. Until Julian noticed the note written on the back. His blood ran cold, because beneath Clara's name someone had written 3 words. Possible daughter confirmed. Julian stared at the words until they blurred. Possible daughter confirmed. Not daughter, not proven daughter, not even likely daughter, confirmed. The difference mattered. His hands tightened around the photograph. Across from him Walter looked older than he had hours earlier. Not because of age, because hope was dangerous, especially after years of disappointment. That's all I ever got, Walter said quietly. The photo? Walter nodded. The investigator mailed it directly to me before Monica could stop it. Julian looked down again. The photograph was old but preserved. Clara Torres stood beside a woman in her 30s. Both were smiling. Neither looked aware that their image would someday become evidence. On the back sat the investigator's handwritten note. No names, no address, just that short sentence. Possible daughter confirmed. Why didn't you show this to anyone? Julian asked. Walter let out a slow breath. Because I didn't know what it meant. The answer hurt because it was honest. An old man holding a mystery he couldn't solve. A father who wasn't sure whether he had lost someone decades ago or imagined the entire possibility. Julian carefully slid the photograph back into the envelope. For the first time, he felt something stronger than suspicion. He felt urgency. Someone had hidden too much for too long. The next morning, he called Rebecca before sunrise. 2 hours later they sat together reviewing everything. The unfinished trust amendment, the private investigator invoice, the photograph, the missing report. Rebecca listened without interruption. When Julian finished, she folded her hands. "We need the investigator. You think he's still alive?" "I think if he retired 7 months ago, there's a good chance." Julian immediately began making calls. The search took most of the day. Eventually they found a forwarding address tied to a retirement community outside Akron. No guarantee, just a lead. It was enough. By late afternoon, Julian was driving south. The sky hung low with gray clouds. Rain threatened the entire trip. His phone buzzed twice. Both calls came from Monica. He ignored both. A third call followed. Then a text, "We need to talk." Julian didn't respond. For the first time in years, he no longer felt obligated to protect family harmony. Family harmony had apparently been built on lies. The retirement community sat beside a quiet lake. Nothing luxurious, nothing run down, just peaceful. The receptionist recognized the investigator's name immediately. Harold Pierce, apartment 214. Julian's pulse accelerated. 10 minutes later, he stood outside a modest door. He knocked, no answer. He knocked again, still nothing. Just as he turned away, the door opened. A white-haired man looked out cautiously. "Can I help you?" Julian introduced himself. The name Reed changed everything. Harold's expression shifted instantly. Not surprise, recognition, and something close to regret. "You'd better come in." The apartment was small. Stacks of boxes lined one wall. Old files filled metal cabinets. Retirement clearly hadn't erased decades of habit. Harold remained standing. I wondered if someone would eventually show up. Julian got straight to the point. "You investigated Clara Torres." Harold nodded. "Years ago, you found something." "I did." Julian showed him the photograph. Harold's shoulders slumped. "I remember that picture." "What does the note mean?" The older man hesitated, long enough to confirm Julian's fears. Then he walked toward a cabinet, unlocked a drawer, removed a thick file and placed it on the table. "This is why your sister wanted me gone." Julian stared. Harold nodded. "She visited me personally." The room seemed smaller. "What did she say?" Harold laughed bitterly. "She said her father was fragile, said the information would destroy him. And you believed her?" "No," the answer came immediately. "I believed she was terrified." Julian felt cold. Terrified people protected something, or hid something. Harold opened the file. Inside sat copies of records, public records, property records, archived correspondence, search logs, years of work. Years Walter never saw. Harold tapped the top page. "I located Clara." Julian's heart pounded. "Alive?" "No," the answer landed heavily. "She passed away several years before I found her records." Julian swallowed. Another door closed, another chance lost, but the file continued. Harold flipped several pages. "I also located her adult daughter." The room fell silent. Even though Julian already knew where this was heading, hearing it spoken aloud felt different, more real, more dangerous. "Elena?" Harold looked directly at him. "I never confirmed that." Julian blinked. "What?" The investigator pointed toward a report. "I found a woman connected to Clara." "Then why write possible daughter confirmed?" "Because Clara identified her as her daughter in multiple legal records." Julian frowned. "Then what wasn't confirmed?" Harold leaned back. "Paternity." The word changed everything. Again, Julian felt his certainty crack. The file proved Clara had an adult daughter. It did not prove Walter was the father. Not yet, not legally, not scientifically, the investigator continued. "I never reached the woman. Why not? Someone got there first." Julian froze. "What do you mean?" Harold slowly removed another document. This one wasn't part of the original report. It had been added later. A handwritten memo, dated nearly a year ago. Harold pointed toward a name, Monica Reed. Julian's stomach tightened. "She contacted the woman?" "I believe so." "You believe?" "I know Monica requested her address." The words echoed in the room. Requested her address. Not her father's, not Clara's, the daughter's. The person Monica feared. The person who threatened everything. Julian suddenly understood something horrifying. Monica's actions had started long before Walter entered Maple Grove. Long before forged signatures. Long before the trust changes. This wasn't a reaction. It was preparation. Years of preparation. What happened after she got the address? Harold shook his head. "I don't know." Julian stared at the paperwork, his mind racing. Every answer seemed to create two new questions. If Monica found Elena first, what did she do? Did she contact her? Warn her? Pay her off, threaten her, or simply watch her from a distance? The possibility made Julian sick, because Elena had spent her entire adult life believing her records ended in blank spaces. Meanwhile, someone else might have known exactly who she was. Harold reached into the file one last time. His expression changed. This time even he looked uncomfortable. There was something else. Julian looked up. What? The investigator slid a sealed photocopy across the table. A letter. From Clara? No, then who? Harold's voice lowered. Monica. Julian's heart nearly stopped. The letter had been addressed to Clara's daughter years earlier. Never mailed, never delivered. Apparently discovered during the investigation. Julian looked at the envelope. Then at Harold. What does it say? I never opened it. Why not? Because it wasn't mine. Julian picked up the folded copy. His hand suddenly felt unsteady. Monica's name appeared beneath the signature line. Proof, not suspicion, not theory. Proof. Whatever happened next had started years before Walter's nursing home placement. Years before the forged documents. Years before Elena ever met any of them. Julian carefully unfolded the first page, and immediately saw the opening sentence. If you are reading this, then you have already learned something about the Reed family that must remain private. Julian read the first paragraph twice, then a third time. The letter wasn't emotional, it wasn't angry, it wasn't even personal. That made it worse. If you are reading this, then you have already learned something about the Reed family that must remain private. My father is elderly and vulnerable. Any attempt to contact him will cause unnecessary harm. Whatever connection you believe exists, I am asking you to leave it alone. Monica had signed her full name beneath the message. There was no threat, no admission, just control disguised as concern. Julian lowered the paper slowly. Harold watched him from across the table. That's the version she wanted on record, the investigator said quietly. The version? Harold nodded. The professional version. Julian looked up. You think there was another one? I think people like Monica rarely tell the same story to everyone. The words followed Julian all the way back to Cleveland. By the time he reached Maple Grove, night had settled over the city. The nursing home corridors were dim. Most residents had already gone to their rooms. Walter was awake, sitting near the window, waiting. The old man immediately recognized the look on Julian's face. You found something. Julian sat beside him. For several seconds he didn't speak. He simply handed over the photograph. Walter stared. His fingers trembled before they even touched it. Then he saw Clara. The breath left his body. Not dramatically, not loudly, just a quiet collapse inside his chest. My God. He traced her face with one finger, the way someone touches a gravestone, the way someone touches a memory. For a long time neither man spoke. Finally Walter looked at the woman standing beside Clara, his eyes filled. That's her. Julian felt his pulse jump. You know? Walter nodded slowly. I've never met her. The sentence sounded impossible. And yet Walter said it with certainty. How? Walter swallowed. She's Clara's smile. Julian looked back at the picture. For the first time he saw it too. Not proof. Not evidence. Just resemblance. The kind that made people wonder. The kind that kept old men awake at night. Walter stared at the photograph for another minute. Then something changed. His expression darkened. Monica knew. Julian said nothing, didn't she? Still Julian remained silent. Walter didn't need the answer, he had already found it. The hurt in his eyes was different from anything Julian had seen before. This wasn't about money, not even about betrayal. It was about lost time, years that could never return. The next morning Julian arranged a private meeting, not with lawyers, not with investigators, with Elena. She agreed reluctantly. They met at a small diner near the lake. The place smelled like coffee and old wood. Elena arrived straight from a shift. Her eyes showed exhaustion. Her posture showed caution. She sat down without ordering anything. What happened? Julian placed the photograph on the table. She stared at it, longer than expected, then looked away. Where did you get this? A private investigator. Elena's jaw tightened. I don't like being investigated. I know. Then why are you doing it? Because every answer seemed to lead back to her. Because Walter's life and her life had begun intersecting in impossible ways. Because Monica appeared to know more about Elena than Elena knew about herself. Julian wanted to say all of that. Instead, he told the truth. Because someone worked very hard to keep you separated from my father. Silence. Elena leaned back slowly. The diner suddenly felt smaller, more crowded, more dangerous. You think he's my father. Julian noticed he hadn't actually said that. Yet she heard it anyway. The possibility had already entered her mind. Maybe weeks ago, maybe years ago. I think someone believed it was possible. Elena laughed once, no humor in it. Possible. She looked out the window. Do you know how many times people have told me they found pieces of my past? Julian remained quiet. They always want something, money, attention, a story, a miracle, something, never truth, just something. Her voice softened. My records are sealed. My adoption file was sealed. Half my life exists in paperwork nobody can access. Julian saw something then, not anger, fatigue, the exhaustion of someone who had spent years being treated like a question mark, a mystery, a possibility, instead of a person. I don't need a family, she said. The sentence sounded rehearsed, maybe because she had repeated it for years. Julian nodded. I'm not trying to give you one. That got her attention. For the first time she looked directly at him, then she looked back at the photograph, at Clara, at the woman she knew only through fragments. What do you want from me? Julian took a careful breath. A DNA test, the words landed heavily. Elena immediately looked away. No, not hesitation, not uncertainty, a boundary. Julian respected that. Okay. The answer surprised her. You aren't going to argue? No. You aren't going to tell me I owe anyone answers? No. For several moments neither spoke. Then Elena folded her arms. Your sister already tried. Julian froze. The diner noise disappeared, everything narrowed. What? Elena's expression hardened. I shouldn't have said that. Julian leaned forward. When, a year ago, his heartbeat accelerated. Monica contacted you? Elena looked angry now, not at him, at herself, at the memory. She came to see me. Every piece inside Julian shifted, the investigator, the hidden report, the letter, the address request. Suddenly it connected. Why didn't you tell me? Because she told me your father was sick. Elena's eyes moved to the photograph. She said he wasn't stable. She said people sometimes imagined connections that weren't real. What else? Elena hesitated, then reached into her purse carefully, deliberately. She removed an envelope, worn, creased, old. I kept this. Julian stared. From Monica? Elena nodded. I almost threw it away. Slowly she slid it across the table. Julian looked at the handwriting. Monica Reed. The same signature. The same careful script. But this wasn't a copy. This was the original. The letter that had actually been delivered. The letter Monica never wanted anyone else to see. Julian opened it. His eyes moved to the second paragraph, and immediately his blood ran cold. Because this version was completely different. Not professional, not careful, not concerned. It contained a single sentence written in sharp blue ink. If you care about your future, stay away from my father and stop asking questions about Clara Torres. Julian read the sentence again, then once more. The paper trembled slightly in his hand. Not because of fear, because of certainty. The woman who publicly claimed she had only protected her father had privately threatened someone she had never met. Across the table, Elena watched his expression carefully. She already knew what was written there. She had carried that letter for a year. A year of wondering why a stranger cared so much about keeping her away. A year of convincing herself it meant nothing. Now it meant everything. There's more, she said quietly. Julian looked up. What? Elena reached for the letter and unfolded the second page. Most of it consisted of vague warnings, references to family complications, claims that Walter Reed was confused, suggestions that pursuing old questions would only lead to disappointment. Then one paragraph stood apart from the rest. Monica had underlined it. If anyone contacts you claiming to represent Walter Reed, please understand that he is not capable of making decisions regarding family matters. Legal authority has already been established. Julian felt cold. Very cold. A year ago, long before Walter entered Melgrove, long before the official paperwork, long before anyone claimed incapacity, Monica had already been laying the foundation, preparing the story, building the cage before locking the door. May I keep this? Julian asked. Elena hesitated, then nodded. Make a copy first, I will. She studied him for a moment. What are you going to do now? Julian folded the letter carefully. The same thing Monica was afraid of. For the first time since they met, Elena almost smiled. Not because anything was funny. Because someone had finally stopped retreating. That evening Julian delivered copies of everything to Rebecca. The photograph, the investigator's file, both letters. Every document went into a growing evidence folder. Rebecca reviewed them in silence. When she finished, she leaned back. This changes things. How much? Enough. Julian waited. Rebecca rarely spoke dramatically. When she did, it mattered. Monica wasn't reacting to events. She tapped the older letter. She was creating them. The distinction hit hard. Reaction suggested panic. Preparation suggested intent. Intent carried consequences. Rebecca organized several pages into separate piles: family records, trust documents, medical records, financial records. Then she stopped. A detail had caught her attention. What is it? Julian asked. She held up a trust statement. This account. Julian looked closer. The Reed family trust, one of several accounts connected to Walter's estate. Rebecca pointed toward a series of withdrawals. Regular, consistent, large. Julian frowned. Consulting fees? That's what they call them. You don't believe that? No, Rebecca's voice hardened. I think someone is laundering estate assets through legal invoices. Julian stared. The numbers stretched back nearly 2 years, before the nursing home, before Walter's supposed decline, before everything, a pattern, not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, a system. The next 3 days disappeared into investigation. Rebecca brought in a forensic accountant, a quiet man named Leonard Shaw, former IRS, meticulous, patient, the type of person who seemed physically incapable of guessing. He only trusted evidence. By Friday afternoon, he had enough to concern everyone. The consulting company receiving trust funds existed, technically, legally registered, tax filings submitted, business address verified, but the office consisted of a single rented room above a closed insurance agency. No employees, no active contracts, no visible operations, nothing. The company existed only on paper, and every payment originated from Walter's estate. Julian stared at the report. Who owns it? Leonard looked uncomfortable. That answer alone told Julian enough. Philip? The room became silent. Philip Reed, attorney, Monica's husband, the man who drafted nearly every document surrounding Walter's care, the man who defended every financial decision, the man who benefited directly. Julian felt anger rise slowly. Not explosive, worse, cold, controlled. The kind that lasted. Leonard continued. The transfers increased sharply after Walter began asking about Clara Torres. Julian froze. What? The accountant turned another page. A timeline appeared. Dates, transactions, communications, patterns, Walter's requests for private investigators, Walter's inquiries about old records, Walter's meetings with estate planners. Then sudden spikes in consulting payments, as if someone anticipated a threat, as if someone feared what Walter might discover. Julian rubbed his eyes. The entire story was changing again. This wasn't just inheritance. This wasn't just control. It was concealment. Someone had been protecting a secret long before Elena appeared, long before the nursing home, long before forged signatures. The secret itself might be the reason everything happened. That realization followed him to Maple Grove. Walter sat near the courtyard window, watching rain fall across the parking lot. His health seemed unchanged, but something inside him looked different, more alert, more determined. The old resignation was fading. Julian sat beside him. For several minutes they simply watched the rain. Then Walter spoke. I remembered something. Julian turned immediately. What? Walter kept looking outside. Clara wasn't the only person who disappeared. A chill moved through Julian. What do you mean? Walter's expression tightened. I hired someone decades ago. His voice slowed, as though he were walking through memory carefully. I was told Clara had moved away. I didn't believe it, so I paid an investigator. Julian listened closely. Walter shook his head. He found her. The words hung in the air. He found her? Walter nodded, briefly. Then what happened? I never received the final report. Julian's pulse quickened. The pattern. Again, missing reports, missing letters, missing information decades apart. Same outcome. What happened to the investigator? Walter finally looked at him. His eyes carried genuine confusion. I don't know. The answer sounded honest, too honest. The old man looked troubled. I always assumed he failed. Julian thought about Monica, about hidden files, about intercepted reports, about how long this might have been happening. Then Walter said something else, something small, something devastating. Your mother knew. Julian stopped breathing for a second. What? Walter looked away. Not everything. Then what? That Clara existed. The rain seemed louder. Walter's voice dropped. She asked me once. Julian waited. What did you tell her? Walter closed his eyes. The truth. The answer surprised him, because throughout this entire investigation, Lies had become normal. But Walter sounded certain. I told her Clara mattered. A pause. I told her I never stopped wondering. The sadness in his voice felt ancient, older than the nursing home, older than the trust, older than Monica, a wound buried beneath decades. Julian sat quietly. Then another question arrived. One he hadn't considered before. If Mom knew. Walter slowly opened his eyes. They met Julian's, and for the first time all week, fear appeared there, real fear. Because he understood where Julian was going. If his mother knew, if Monica knew, if the first investigator disappeared, if the second report vanished, then perhaps this secret had never belonged to one person. Perhaps it belonged to generations. Perhaps someone else had protected it first. That night, Julian couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m, his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost ignored it. Almost. Instead, he answered. A woman's voice spoke immediately, low, urgent. You need to stop looking at Monica. Julian sat upright, every nerve alert. Who is this? A pause. Then 3 words. The wrong sibling. The line went dead. For several seconds, Julian stared into darkness. Then his phone vibrated again. A new message. No sender name, just a photograph. An old black and white picture. Walter, Clara, and a third person standing between them. A woman Julian recognized instantly. His mother, and written across the bottom in fading ink were 4 words that changed everything. Taken before the agreement. I can continue the story, but I no longer have the actual text of the previous chapters in context, only the original outline. The chapter you just provided appears to have already diverged significantly from the approved outline, introducing the anonymous caller, Julian's mother's involvement, and the agreement, which were not in the approved chapter plan. To keep continuity accurate and avoid contradictions, please paste the most recent completed chapter, or the last 1-2 chapters, and I'll write the next chapter seamlessly from that exact ending. Walter looked at the document Monica had placed in front of him and pushed it away. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady rhythm of a heart monitor. Julian stood near the window. Elena remained by the door. The attorney and social worker sat nearby, watching carefully. Monica forced a smile. Dad, this is just a clarification. Walter slowly lifted his eyes. No. The single word landed harder than anyone expected. Philip stepped forward. Walter, all we're asking is that you confirm you've been manipulated by No, Walter repeated. This time his voice was stronger. He looked directly at Elena. She never asked me for anything. Then he turned toward Monica. But you did. For a moment nobody spoke. Years of fear, guilt, and silence seemed to collapse inside that hospital room. Monica's face tightened. You don't understand what's happening, she said. I've spent years protecting this family. Walter nodded slowly. That's what you kept telling yourself. The social worker quietly documented every statement. The attorney asked Walter several questions regarding his wishes, his finances, and his healthcare decisions. Walter answered clearly. His memory was intact. His intentions were consistent. When the meeting ended, Monica left without another word. Philip followed her. Neither looked back. Within days, Julian's attorney filed emergency motions challenging the authority Monica and Philip had exercised over Walter's affairs. The investigation expanded quickly. Financial records from the trust were reviewed. Bank transfers were examined. Invoices were questioned. The nursing home's files were subpoenaed. What investigators found was not dramatic enough for television, but it was devastatingly real. Money had been moved. Decisions had been made without proper disclosure. Walter's alleged incapacity had been exaggerated repeatedly in official paperwork. No single document proved everything. Together they painted a clear picture. Control had slowly replaced care. Monica's charity board announced that she would step away pending review. Several donors quietly withdrew support. Philip faced questions from his professional oversight committee regarding conflicts of interest and fiduciary conduct. Neither went to jail, neither lost everything. But the image they had spent years building began to crack. And for people who had valued reputation above almost everything else, that consequence hurt deeply. Walter never celebrated their downfall. To Julian's surprise, he rarely mentioned them at all. He seemed more interested in what remained than in what had been lost. A month later, Walter left Maple Grove. The morning was cool and bright. Several staff members came outside to say goodbye. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked genuinely happy for him. Elena stood beside Julian as Walter slowly walked toward the waiting vehicle. He still needed his cane. His steps remained careful. His heart condition required ongoing treatment. Nothing had magically healed. But nobody was deciding his life for him anymore. That alone changed everything. The new house sat near a quiet lake outside Cleveland. It wasn't enormous. Julian could have bought something 10 times larger without noticing the expense. Instead, he chose a modest single-story home designed for accessibility and comfort. Wide hallways, large windows, a small garden, a kitchen that naturally brought people together. Walter approved immediately. "It feels like a home," he said. "Not a facility, not an investment, a home." The hardest relationship to rebuild was not between Walter and Julian. It was between Walter and Elena. DNA had answered one question. It had not repaired decades of absence. Neither pretended otherwise. Walter never demanded to be called father. Elena never offered instant forgiveness. Instead, they started with small conversations. Coffee in the morning, short walks near the lake, stories about Clara, questions that had waited years for answers. Sometimes the conversations went well. Sometimes they ended in silence, but both kept showing up. That mattered. One evening, Walter handed Elena a small box. Inside were letters. Some were copies recovered during the investigation. Others were notes Walter had written but never sent. His hands trembled slightly. "I don't expect this to fix anything," he said. "I know." She looked through the stack. Years of missed opportunities sat inside a cardboard box. Too much had been lost, yet for the first time nothing was being hidden. That felt different. Julian stayed in Cleveland far longer than originally planned. The London office continued operating without him. Video meetings replaced flights. Business became secondary. For years he had convinced himself that sending money was enough. Now he understood the difference between financial support and presence. Some lessons arrived late, but late was still better than never. One afternoon, Walter and Julian sat on the back porch overlooking the water. The silence between them felt comfortable for the first time. "I'm sorry," Julian finally said. Walter looked at him. "For what?" "For not seeing any of this." Walter thought about it. "You came back." Julian lowered his eyes. "I should have come sooner." "Maybe." Walter nodded. "Maybe I should have asked for help sooner too." Neither man tried to carry all the blame anymore. Life was rarely that simple. The truth had enough weight without adding more. Autumn arrived gradually. The garden behind the house began to change color. Walter spent more time outside. Some days he needed help getting up from his chair. Some days his cane remained close at hand. Recovery was not a straight line. Healing wasn't either. But dignity had returned. Choice had returned. His voice had returned. One evening, as sunlight faded across the lake, 3 people sat around the kitchen table. Walter, Julian, Elena. No lawyers, no investigations, no hidden files, no forged signatures. Just dinner cooling on the table and honest conversation filling the room. The family was incomplete. The damage remained real. Nothing could return the years that had been stolen. Yet something important had survived. The truth. And because of that truth, a different future became possible. Walter smiled as Elena told a story from work. Julian laughed. For a moment, nobody looked away, nobody hid. Nobody pretended. The silence that followed felt peaceful rather than painful. Outside, the lake reflected the last light of the evening. Inside, 3 lives continued forward, not fully healed but finally honest. If this story made you think of someone who deserved to be heard sooner, share your thoughts below. And don't forget to join us for another unforgettable story.